Thank you very much for the introduction, and thank you everyone for attending. I know I'm competing against another talk track with some pretty awesome talks, so maybe there'll be a bunch of you watching on the recording if that gets out later. So yes, I'm Michael. I work for SailPoint, and today I want to talk to you a bit about identity security, how organizations know who you are, and in particular, what you can access. But also I want to connect that to cybersecurity leadership, which is why I thought today I'd put on a sports jacket, be a bit leadership-y. And what I want you to take away from this talk today, whether you're listening in person or whether you're watching the video at some point in the future, is that identity security is a unifying theme for businesses, not just across security, but as a part of how the business runs as well. And I'll link that back to how I think that's important for you as cybersecurity students to understand as we go forward. So yeah, a little bit about me. As per the intro, I've worked across most major vertical in Australia, New Zealand, a bit in Singapore as well. And importantly, I've worked at the different sort of software levels. So in the industry, we would say there's customer land, where people use software to service their customers. And then there's also vendor land, which is where I currently work, where you make software for customers to use. There's also another land called the integrator land, where you take the software and you enable it for customers to use. And I've worked in all three within the identity security space, and they all have different angles on this problem. So I'm going to try and bring those today as we talk about it. Let me get my slides ticking. So, I'm going to ask a fair bit of questions as I go forward. The first one is, who has waited for access to something at some point? Maybe like an application. Yeah, a couple of hands. Is anyone willing to volunteer how long you had to wait for access? A day, an hour, a week, a month? A couple of days? Okay, yeah, that's a really good example. So, for many of you, if you haven't had work, but for those who have, waiting for access to do something that's a part of your job is actually, unfortunately, pretty common. It's a challenge, hence the image of frustration. You just want to do your job, and you need access across a bunch of applications to do that, but you don't have that access. So, some parallels in the university world would be maybe you need access to a lab, or maybe there's some particular tool in an internship that you need access to, right? So that feeling of being stuck, of being frustration, that is a challenge that organizations face all the time. And we've got Dave in the audience as one of our customer success managers, and he sees this across so many of the customers that he works with all the time, as do I. So I want you to imagine that challenge of a couple of days waiting for whatever access it was. I want you to imagine that across an organization of, say, 20,000 people. Every time someone starts that organization, every time someone needs to work on a new project, every time someone changes roles, they're going to need to get additional access, and they're probably going to feel a lot like this guy as a part of that process of getting access. So I hope what you're starting to see is that this isn't just an IT headache, a challenge, but it's actually something that's causing lost productivity. When I don't have access, I'm not able to do my work. It's causing security gaps, maybe while I borrow someone else's account to do that work. So I'll give you an example. The one was 2 days. There was a couple other hands raised. One of Australia's big four banks I was working at for a while to deliver some IT outcomes for them. And so when I first came in, I thought, yep, great, I'll get right on it, I'll have access straight away. No, I didn't have access. So first day, raised some more tickets, talked to my manager, tried to get, second week, still didn't have access. Third week, yeah, a little bit more access, but not the actual full-on access I needed. It took 6 weeks for one of Australia's big four banks to give me the access I needed to even get started on doing my job. and in that time they were paying my employer probably a very, very high daily rate. So it's just a waste, right, of my time. I'm feeling like the gentleman on screen wanting to do my job, but I don't have that access. So with that frustration in mind, let's talk a little bit about what identity security actually is. So it's kind of simple. Identity security, right person, right access, right time. And I put down the bottom evidence. Something we often don't think about when we're designing systems is that we're going to have proof. So for most major organizations, at some point an audit is going to come in, or especially in finance, medicine, or if you're a listed company, they may even have a regulator that demands certain information. They'll want to know, hey, Dave, I see you've got this access. Who approved that access? When was it given? How was that automated? Do we actually have proof that it was taken off you when you left that job? So it sounds kind of simple, making sure the right people have the right access at the right time, but there's a whole bunch of nuances to doing this. And we can see from my example and the gentleman's example earlier that it's actually quite often that it doesn't go to plan. Easy to say, hard to do. So part of the problem in organizations, and this is where I start to link this a bit more to the business and the leadership side, is that you've got competing priorities in this access space. So if we think about an organization, well, in one support function, you've got human resources. Human resources would care a whole heap about the onboarding experience. When I started at that Big Four bank, did I get my access quickly? Well, no, it was a really terrible experience for me, right? You've got IT and they're caring about efficiency. They've got a whole lot of costs over their help desks for often granting all this access and taking it away. And they're currently paying for that and it takes ages. That's not something that they want. Of course, from your perspective, hopefully you're thinking also cybersecurity cares about this, right? If we're giving access to lots and lots of people and we're not taking it off them, we're probably not going to be doing least privilege. So when a breach happens, it's going to be catastrophic when the account is compromised. Compliance, they're going to want, from that previous slide, they're going to want that evidence. Can we supply that to our auditors? Are we complying with our regulations? And Dave, feel free to jump in if you've got thoughts anytime. Digital teams are going to want speed and so on. And these are just the support areas of a business. These are just supporting all sorts of different business units out there. Each of these business units within the business are probably going to have different applications, different tools, and different priorities. I'll give you an example. A supermarket. The stores, they care about maybe seasonal workers having access quickly to their point of sale systems and maybe their stock systems. The supply chains and the logistics, they're about managing warehouses, delivery systems. E-commerce wants a customer and websites. Marketing, they've got campaigns and they want access to all the customer data they can. Procurement, they're negotiating with suppliers and they have particular applications for that. And so there are conflicts. The store staff want access now for their seasonal workers. Marketing at the same time wants broad access to customer data. And you've got all of those support functions that I just mentioned having all of their priorities layered over each of these different business unit demands. And that's partly what's making that guy on the earlier slide so frustrated. He's sitting there thinking, this is so easy. Can't you just give me access to this one SharePoint site? But this is the business complexity behind giving that access. To add to this complexity, we often think of enterprises in very simple terms. You've got SharePoint, you've got Active Directory or Entra, and then you're kind of done. But the reality is that most businesses will have hundreds of applications with many more databases and infrastructure beneath them, all of which come back to that access problem. Different people will need access to those different layers. So I know that was very businessy and didn't sound very cyber, but what I was trying to do is draw a thread through identity security and the challenges that it faces in business, bringing it back to access. So I'm going to pause there and ask for questions because I'm I'm certain that there must be some people out there thinking, Michael, what on earth are you talking about? And I was hoping to have swag to throw at people, but I forgot to bring it. So, first question. Dave, you might have to come up with one. I'll get Dave to think about a question while you guys think of one. I can prompt with, have any of you experienced this kind of frustration, or do you know someone in their working career that has complained about access? Or another question, the fragmentation that I talked about in the previous slide, about all those different priorities in a business and different business units having competing priorities, does that make sense to you? If not, I can explain it in a different way. Perfect.
How can we automate it and how complex it is?
Mm-hmm. So, yes, and that is absolutely a part, I guess, of what we're talking about, the user access provisioning. So that's an important term. We're talking about how can we provision access and I guess unprovision or deprovision access as well. And so I guess SailPoint has a tool that does that. And last year I talked a little bit about some of the technology pieces that is used to do that. And I guess what I'm trying to explain in this talk is how there's a lot of business complexity behind that access provisioning. Does that make sense?
I'm talking about automating them.
Yeah. So I guess the way that it works in most businesses, just doing a time check, yep. The way that it works in most businesses is you start off quite small and you've just got a couple of people and they just do all the access provisioning, right? You're a small company, maybe there's just one IT person, they're just like, cool, Dave needs access, I give him access. I need access, I give myself access, right? Then you get a bit bigger and that starts to get a bit onerous, maybe a few hundred people. So then you've got a bigger IT team and you maybe start writing some scripts. You have a little bit of a help desk where people can raise tickets for additional access. Maybe you have a couple of approval steps in there. But then you get sort of to the 1,000, 2,000, 3,000, 5,000 people mark. Suddenly, that help desk is costing you a lot of money. Suddenly, the regulators are asking for proof about these access processes. Suddenly, when help desk misspells the access or puts in the wrong one and it exposes the CEO's financial details, that's a major issue on a listed company. And so it's in that later stage where we need to move from just a help desk and ticketing and scripts into a system like SailPoint, where we are automating and providing a whole bunch of services on top of that to make it smooth. Does that make sense? Cool. That was an awesome question. I appreciate you being first. Did you have a follow-on question? That's all good. Not at this point. Cool. Any other questions before we carry on?
What about AI?
What about AI?
I see, AI agents from Workday and things like that. That seems kind of weird. And, does that relate with identity security?
Yeah, great question. So I probably should have repeated the question from earlier for the recording, but I'll repeat this one. What about AI? How does that factor into this challenge? And I was a little bit simplistic on this side. I said the right person. The reality, it's often the right thing in this case, because actually there's a lot of complexity behind what the identity, which is why it's often called identity security, because that identity might be a person. It might be Michael that needs to access something at the right time, but it might be an AI agent. It might be a service account. It might not be an employee. It might be a contractor. So think of right identity or right thing. It's a lot more complex, and it's becoming more and more complex, especially as agentic AI comes out. One of the big banks that I'm talking to, actually one in Australia and one in New Zealand, as they're rolling out agentic AI, they're asking, okay, we're managing people's access, but how are we going to manage the access that all of these AI agents have? And more complex, what if they're acting on behalf of someone? How do we know that they only have the behalf access, not other access? So it is a major challenge, and it is one that we are trying to address as an industry. And actually, we will be releasing a piece of software, a component of our software to do that next month. So yeah, that's a good question, Dave. You're allowed to come up with more, both of you. All right. Actually, no, we'll move on, and I'll break for more questions in a moment. So, taking it back to an analogy, when you first started at university, you would have got a student ID card or a digital, login of some kind, and that card decided whether or not you could maybe get into a research library or a lab, or, in my day, like staff discounts or discounts at the cafe or something like that, right? So just like as the slide describes, talking about whether or not you have access or whether you don't, identity security is something that is going to be critical for an organization to be function, either stopping people from access or allowing them to access. So it's the digital equivalent. And I guess if to carry on that analogy of a student ID, if someone got your student login, well, then they would be able to act on your behalf. And it's exactly the same in organizations from a cybersecurity perspective. People are going to be able to get into accounts and act on people's behalf. If we haven't done least privilege and make sure the access that they have is limited, then the blast radius for that attack is going to be increased. So I'm going to add another layer, and this sort of links in with that question around user provisioning a little bit. Identity governance and administration and the identity lifecycle. So on this page are a whole bunch of industry terms. One of them is actually the first letter of the top three, JML, the joiner, mover, and leaver process. So this is something that doesn't really get taught in cybersecurity classes, but is really important in industry in terms of this space of identity security. So, for example, when you're thinking about an organization, you want to be thinking, okay, a new student, say at university, arrives, or a new employee in an organization, they're going to need access on day one. That's a joiner process. A mover process. So in the university student context, maybe they change degrees, or in an employee context, maybe they change department, or maybe they change their role. A mover event. We're going to have to grant some new access and, importantly, for least privilege, take away some access so that we just don't get access building over time. And then the leaver process. To use the student analogy, a person might graduate or leave university early, or in the employee context, someone might resign, maybe they've have another job, so we need to make sure that we remove all of their access as a part of that. And in that joiner, mover, leaver process, we need to be considering, as I mentioned earlier, the governance. Who approved these? When was the access changed? What changed it? When you asked that system to remove that access, did that system actually remove that access? The reconciliation process, checking whether what we asked actually did happen. To unpack a little bit of these terms, I guess, so the identity lifecycle is talking about that cycle of the identity, the access they gain, the access that changes through the mover process, and the access being removed. And identity governance and administration is talking about how we govern the access and how we administer the access in the joiner, mover, leaver process. All right, one more slide, and then I'll pause for questions. So this is where I want to tie into cybersecurity. My partner in particular loved this slide because it shows just how easy it is to get into someone's account. We're often taught as cybersecurity students that we've got strong authentication, we've got MFA, we've got long passwords and policies and so on. The truth is it's really easy to get into someone's account. In fact, what most of the students are currently listening to, the social engineering one, is one of the best ways. Call up a help desk, fake, get their password reset sent to you and get in that way. Or even, once you've figured out what a student's password may be, maybe from a dark web dump, Just keep trying it. Eventually the person will give up and allow them on their MFA prompt, and you're in. And if you haven't done identity security well, once you're in, you're going to have a huge amount of access, much more than you should, which is a massive cybersecurity risk. So some examples: stolen passwords, like as in terms of identity security risks, contractor accounts that were never deactivated. I can think of several recent breaches that were related to that, or people just with far more access than their role needed. And also, if you think back to the previous slide, if we are governing all of this access and checking whether or not the access changes we requested actually happened, another advantage that gives an identity security system is when that access changes and we didn't ask for it, we can alert or remove that additional access. So if you think back to when you were learning maybe about lateral movement or adding access to an account, because obviously you'll compromise an account, but then you'll want to increase its access, or you want to jump to another account and increase its access. As you do that, you're going to be making changes to the access of these accounts. And as an identity security tool, if that's monitoring all the access everyone has and go, hold on a moment, Dave's a customer service manager, but he's just added domain administrator to his account. Should he have that? Should he not? Should we revoke that? Should we notify the SOC team? So this is a tie-in for identity security to how it fits back into that cyber domain. There's a term that has become quite popular in cybersecurity circles that is that hackers actually no longer break in, they just log in. And when you think about it from that perspective, when you assume that a hacker is going to be able to sign into someone's account somewhere in your organization, or probably already has, it's really important that you've done all this other process around access to have limited that access or to make sure it's not going to grow once they're in. I'm going to give a quick, very short history lesson on identity security, and then we'll stop for questions, so start thinking about some questions to ask. It used to be that identity security was never talked about. And that was because when Dave and I were working back early in our careers, we could run a perimeter defense pretty easily. When I did my first work out of university, I had to be in the office. I couldn't just do it connected to the internet. I had to actually go in and use a computer at a desk. I had to be on the local area network. I had to be right there. And all of the applications that I used, none of them were out in the cloud. They were all in the server room, right next to me, or down in the basement. The applications, the people, the computers they used, the information that was sent between them was all isolated on premise. And so you could sort of say, hey, it's Dave sitting at his desk, it's Michael at his desk, there's nothing bad going on, we've got a firewall around this, we're feeling pretty safe. We didn't have to worry as much about the identity and the access. But then a whole bunch of things changed. One of them was that people left, especially due to COVID, but even before that, people were starting to work from all over the place. Also, the applications also ran out of the building. They're now hosted in the cloud by all sorts of different vendors. You don't have control over them, right? They're all over the place. But also the diversity isn't quite the word I'm looking for. The variety or makeup of our workforce changed. It used to be that there was a lot of employees. You could trust them. They were there. Now supply chains are heavily integrated. So you might have a little bit of process being done from supplier X, a little bit of that process being done from supplier Y, and all this is being done on an application that you don't control. So therefore, there's no way to run a perimeter defense around this. You've got to be thinking about identity and access to be able to run security, which is why identity security is now one of the 5 key pillars in cybersecurity frameworks. So, I promised I would stop for questions. Questions? And Dave, I'll get you to start thinking again. Or maybe Steve, you have some questions this time. No? Oh, come on. But yeah, I'll hold for a moment. So I think we've got time.
What are those 5 pillars?
Ooh, what are those 5 pillars? So there's identity security, there's applications, there's networking, and I forget what the other 2 are, apologies.
Okay, or a better question, I guess, in context of students here, why, okay, and I'll just say, being out there at the booth, so many people are saying, yeah, I want to be an ethical hacker, I want to be a pen tester, everything. There's a million people doing that, but why would I want to be interested in identity security?
Yeah, that is a very good question. Why should a cybersecurity student be interested in identity security? And I will hold that one because I have a little slide towards the end, but that's a good question. So now that I've talked a little bit about, and just jump up with hands or speak up if you've got questions, but I will pause later on for more. Now that I've talked a little bit about what identity security is, a little bit about how it works, why it's important, some of the complexities in organizations, I now want to talk about the title of this talk, which was Silos to Synergy. And so this is about how we have all of these silos in organizations, these different people with different priorities. How is identity security bringing those together? Welcome, welcome. Take a seat. So the first thing I'm going to talk about is some of the values that that identity security brings to an organization. So operations, faster onboarding, the access request process, reduced licensing costs. In fact, I have one healthcare customer that paid for all of SailPoint and then more, like the entire deployment, everything, just on the licensing costs they saved from revoking access of people that didn't need it because there was associated licensing with them. And what I'm trying to weave through each of these different values is that most of the things that you learn in your lectures are going to be about tying down risk, but they come at a cost to the business and they provide no additional value apart from tying down risk. Identity security is one of the only, or maybe the only, cybersecurity initiative that is not just going to tie down risk, but it's also going to supply a whole bunch of other value, namely the operations that I just mentioned, security, obviously that's the risk tie down, the compliance, the audit readiness. It is hard to express just how painful audits are for organizations. Sometimes they can take an entire half year preparing for an audit. Or when one of the big 4 consultants come in and they say, hey, show me this, they need to go take 50 million screenshots of that process, supply it to them, and do that same thing for 6 weeks, every day, hour out and hour, just to be able to prove this stuff and go look at logs. We can automate and make that process much, much easier. Another one that's often not mentioned even by people in my industry is the user experience. It matters a lot to people whether when they need new access, it's easy for them to go request it, know who it's waiting on for approval, and then once it's approved, that it gets provisioned immediately and gets provisioned without error. So one of the other challenges of having help desk do this is they'll often misspell stuff or add the wrong access or make a mistake, right? So these are 4 really big drivers. Hopefully the security one makes sense. Fewer breaches, you have got tighter controls. But I think even bigger than each of these drivers is that identity security is fundamental to an organization's ability to operate. So what do I mean by that? I'll give you an analogy in health. So let's say you're a nurse or you're a doctor and you're wanting to maybe dispense medication. So you're trying to sign into your medical system, and either there's some issue with your sign-in, or once you get in, more importantly, you don't have the right access. That's going to delay your care. Or if we're thinking maybe in the energy sector, you need to make some changes in the OT environment and you don't have the access to be able to do that, and you need to be like the guy on the first slide, frustrated and wait for days. That's going to slow down service delivery and cost us, the public, more money. So I guess understanding that identity ensures the right access in the right moment for critical resources. And when you think about identity security in this way, not only is it not just not a risk tie down, it's something that provides a whole bunch of value, but it's something that's fundamental to a business even being able to operate at all. Actually, I have an example from healthcare. So I was talking with a clinician a couple of weeks ago, and I asked him, I said, like, just out of curiosity, because he also he works in an identity security field, and I said, like, why do you think identity security is important in the hospital setting since you actually administer care to patients? And he said, well, Michael, like, it's all these reasons that you talked about. Yeah, we need the records, and we need the faster access and so on. But he said it's even more than that. He said, because one of the things that I do is I go into hospitals, I ask them for their records, and then I help them tell them how they can improve medicine. But if in those records they haven't had good identity security, those records are not going to be very helpful. Because if the nurse who was dispensing the medication couldn't sign in, she'll borrow someone else's account and you won't know who did it. Or if she was able to sign in but she didn't have the right access, and so she had to use someone else's account, or during the operation the notes were made incorrectly against the right surgeon, you have no idea. So when he goes in to try to improve at the national level healthcare systems, if identity security wasn't done right in the hospital system, it's very hard for him to help improve the healthcare system. So it's a really strong example of just how important identity security and the provisioning of access is. We could actually have better health outcomes if we did identity security better. Yeah, another example would be, imagine if a bank had people record transactions against the wrong people or something like that. The regulator would, rip them to shreds. It's just such an important piece of the puzzle. So for the next slide, I'm going to map some of these values to leaders of organizations. And I know for some of you on the recording or here, it's going to seem a little bit strange that I'm talking about C-suite leaders and why identity security matters to them. But as you go through your careers, and even as you start, it's really important for you to be thinking, hey, these people at the top of my chain, this is how they're thinking about this area, why it's important to them. So, a CEO, usually the person really, really up high, they're wanting, faster growth, faster speed to market. They're wanting to do mergers and acquisitions. You know what's going to help make that easier? If they've got really good controls around their access. If they want to do a merger, they're combining two organizations, two full sets of access. If both those organizations have really good controls and systems, they're going to be easy to combine. A divestiture, you're cutting an organization. If you already clearly understand who needs what access, it's going to be very easy to split when you copy out data and say who has access to things. The same with the speed to market. You need this new application to do this new thing in marketing. If you've got a good identity security system, you're going to be able to push that access out really quickly to your organization. The CFO, they're caring about, once it comes back, efficiency, lower audit costs, fewer fines, reduced licensing cost waste. They care about money, right? They want to reduce those costs. But if we think back, imagine the costs to manually giving access and taking access away from 20,000 people over 500 applications, which is not a big organization in today's day and age. We've got an organization that has 1 million staff. So just absolutely huge scales that we're working on in terms of cost. And I think I mentioned that example earlier about an organization that actually paid for an entire identity security system through what they saved in licensing costs that they were able to take off people. CPO, or sometimes you call it the CHRO, the human resources person, they're caring about better employee experience. You know, when I was talking about starting at the Big Four bank, and it took me 6 weeks to get access, well, that wasn't a very nice experience. Didn't really make me want to work there again. right? It was very frustrating for me. And CPOs or CHROs, they care a lot about that. They want retention. I'm not just going to need an access change when I start my employment. I'm going to be changing projects throughout my entire time there, right? My access needs are going to change. And every time, if I have to wait 6 weeks, man, eventually might just go to their competitor, right? Chief Risk Officer. So this is slightly different from a CISO. They're caring about risk at a more organizational level. So they want to reduce overall risk. They want stronger resilience. The CISO under them, they're thinking about mature control. So hopefully you guys already would have looked at frameworks like NIST or ISO 27001. So the CISO is thinking like, where do we sit on these frameworks? How strong are our controls around access? Do we have approvals? Are they working well? Can we report to auditors? Do we have role-based access control in place? How well are we doing this, right? They care about faster detection. I talked earlier about when someone has their access change. Does that cause a notification? If it's incorrect, does it get removed, right? They care about all these kinds of things. And of course, reduced breach impact. If we are doing least privilege through an identity security system, when the breach happens, it'll only do the least privilege damage. Now, if we're just letting people be copying access and giving access to everyone, they're going to have this much access. So all the data is going to end up on the dark web, or whatever the breach was, the ransomware event, or whatever it is. The CIO, so they also care about costs because they run the help desk and they're wanting to provision all the IT things to help the CEO have his growth or her growth or their growth, I should say. So they care about the lower cost. They care about all the teams beneath them being happier instead of, resetting passwords all the time and having to go manually provision access. They want them to be thinking about much more interesting things. How can we solve these problems at a higher scale and not have a whole help desk just focused on access, removal, and granting. And I added in operational leaders down the bottom, the smoother delivery and happier customers, because these are, in a way, sort of support functions, but then you'll have a whole bunch of different business units that are wanting different levels of operational speed, like that supermarket example I gave earlier, where there's all sorts of different operational leaders out there that care about different things, and we're wanting to make sure we're servicing their needs. As well. So in all of these things, it's the same technology, it's the same program of work. I'm all talking about identity security and the value it can bring to each of these individuals or teams. And coming back to what I said at the beginning, what I'm trying to do is show you that identity security is a thread that goes through the organization. And if you can learn this language, learn this area, it's a huge advantage because most cybersecurity students, they're going to be thinking about, pen testing or, bugs in code or firewalls or whatever, right? There's thousands of people that do that. And there's some people that are very great at that and have successful careers. But out of all of the areas in industry, in terms of demand to supply ratios, identity security is the one, at the moment, with the highest demand and the lowest supply. I had a guy from one of the integrators walk past the desk, and Dave and I were talking, like, do you have any intern spots open? And he said, I have 5 spots now that I would gladly fill. And I think they're doing an email out later after the event with the details. But that's just an example of the kind of demand that we have in this field. And unfortunately, it's something that's not taught. When I delivered my lecture a couple of years ago now at UTS, no one had really, when I asked some of the students and even the lecturers, like, wow, I haven't really heard about this stuff, but we need you out there in the industry. So, I'm going to pause for a moment. Any quick questions before I move on? Hey!
Thanks for the Q&A pause. I really like it.
Oh, great.
You mentioned that the identity security can save money on auditing. I'm quite interested because it's the first time that cybersecurity can be measured using money.
Yeah.
So I want to say, how do they save the money in detail, save on auditing?
Yep. So.
Any other examples? Yeah.
Yes, absolutely. And Dave, feel free to chime in if you've got examples as well. So audits are usually a very painful process for organizations, where the auditing firm, or sometimes it's also a regulator that's conducting the audit or asking for particular proof or information. And if you don't have an identity security tool, you would spend hundreds of man-hours coming up with the proof and all this information that they need. If you have an identity security tool, you can just say, yep, we've got all that information, here are the reports, have fun. Or we'll give you, in fact, in the SailPoint product, we have actually a role sort of called auditor, and you can just give the auditor access, and they can come in, look at how everyone got access, how it was removed, who approved it, and all these things, so they can answer their own questions, which means those hundreds of man-hours that you would have spent answering the audit queries, you can now spend on much more important things, and therefore you save that money. Often people actually hire external consultants in to help them answer audits, and you can usually drastically reduce that cost. Does that answer the question?
Yeah.
Yes, sir.
Just to add on to that, like we do use SailPoint in my business at work, and like one of the requirements for like access management for like the more secure roles is a justification for that particular access and role. And I guess recently we've been asked by internal auditors of why did this person get this access? How long did it take them to get this access? Why were they given this access? And like the applications that weren't actually on SailPoint, we actually had to get one of my direct reports to actually spend time going through their emails, going through all these tickets to actually get those details. It took him maybe around like 3 hours of going back through like a lot of different emails and different chains and permissions from different managers.
Yeah.
But what we did find with like SailPoint, with the apps on it, everything was already there, everything was recorded. There was a lot of traceability,
Yeah.
and the paper trail was easy to pick up.
Yeah. Perfect. Live example. Love it. So for the recording, very briefly, playback, basically there's a gentleman in the crowd. They use SailPoint at work, and it was talking about the story where someone came and said, hey, I need some proof on how this access was automated. And for the ones inside SailPoint, it was very easy to say, look, yeah, here's the proof, here's how it happened, how long was it, all these different information. But for the ones that were provisioned manually, oh my goodness, who sent the email? When was it sent? When was it provisioned? What were the logs in that system? What time zone were they in? All of these questions, and it took 3 hours for one question. Regulators and auditors are asking thousands of questions about thousands of accounts. So it's just huge, huge time. Yes, ma'am.
Sorry.
It's okay.
Yeah, I have two questions actually.
Yes.
The first one is as a cybersecurity student.
Yes.
I think like identity, like engineers quite new things. Like I like first time I heard it when I come here.
Yeah.
Do you have anything like materials and resources to study about it?
I do. So I know you've got two questions. I'll answer this one. So the question for the recording was, what materials do you have to help me, into this space? Yes, I thought I submitted a whole bunch of materials as a part of the submission for this talk to the organizers. But I realize now in the back of my head that might be for a talk I'm doing in October at the CyberSecurity convention. So come to the stand afterwards and I'll dig up that list and happy to share it with you. Yeah. But very quickly for anyone who is listening to the recording, a really good organization to look into is ID Pro, as in Identity Professional. Basically, it's a body of professionals like myself, all focused on identity security, and they have a book of knowledge which has a whole bunch of free material about this space. So that'd be one of the big ones that I'd check out. What's the second question?
Yeah. So when you mentioned about example about hospitalities and also healthcare and these two things, feels like you are assigned like several different like qualifications into like several sectors, right? But what if but we working with the one big project working together, right? So do you also kind of roll into one put into big thing into one space, like managing like they're having several different like levels of securities and also access to they all have a different access, right? But eventually I feels like they have to put into one space. make a one big project because we're working with the one big thing. I think healthcare is kind of different thing because they're working separately with like somebody working in the nursing sector, somebody working in the pharmacy sector. But what if we're working in the big project, working together? So we have to put into one big thing into one space, or I just wanna ask about that.
Okay, so I'll try to answer, and then you can let me know whether I understood the question correctly. So, were you asking, like, yes, there's different sectors and different departments and organizations, and they would have their own access requirements, but what if people from different sectors or different departments were all working on one project? How would the access work there? Yeah.
Any rules or management to do that one?
100%. So, role-based access control is one of the tools that's useful in that space. And if I take a step back, I'll just check the time. Cool. Access kind of falls in, or I would say access falls into 3 different buckets. You've got birthright access, like you are working in this healthcare institution, or you are a contractor working in this particular organization, right? You just, because you're a contractor, because you're an employee, you get this stuff, birthrights, kind of like a passport. You just get it because you've arrived, right? Then there is, you might say, systemic role or automatically assigned role-based access. So you might say, hey, you're a nurse, you're in emergency, you get this. Or you're a banker, you're working in the branch in Sydney, you get this. And those can both be driven based off information from HR or from other systems, because it's just simple, it's birthright, or it's related to your role or your department or your location, something like that. But then there's also ad hoc role-based access. So maybe we're all working on a project. HR doesn't know about it, but we're all working on this project. So we can all go into SailPoint or whatever our identity security system is and say, hey, this whole team, they all need access to this SharePoint site and this financial application and this level, and then that'll all, after approvals if needed, will automatically provision in those systems. And we might say, hey, the project's going to be 3 months. So then it would automatically be removed after those 3 months, or we could put an extension. And I guess maybe to answer your question, it's all done in the same identity security system, whether it's project-based access or whether it's role-based access, it's all a part of the same piece. Does that answer? Sort of. All right, I'll carry on, but I will stop hopefully one more time for questions before the end. So I want to try and give some examples, try and make it a little bit more real for you. So first example or case study, digital bank, onboarding across 40 applications. So before doing identity security, when they were just doing it manually, or maybe trying to use scripts, it took them 10 days. But once they introduced an identity security tool that could do automated lifecycle, that user provisioning, that first question asked about, they're able to do it in 0 days. And if you think back to some of those advantages from the C-suite that I was talking about before, an example might mean that the contact centers are able to hit their staffing targets on time for a major campaign, which is a business advantage on the CEO or maybe for an operational leader. And honestly, this 10 days to 0 days, like I gave you the example of me at a Big Four bank of it taking 6 weeks, I have another story for you. So a couple of years ago, I was at a healthcare conference, and a rural nurse came up to the SailPoint stand, just like the one out here, but obviously all healthcare people. And I asked the nurse, she was like, oh, what do you guys do? And I said, asking about her. And I said, when you hire a new team member, because she was a manager, I said, how long does it take them to get access? And she actually said the same. She said 6 weeks. I said, oh my goodness, it takes you 6 weeks for your nurses that you hire to get access? She said, yeah, 6 weeks. I said, okay, so what do you do in the meantime? She said, well, they use my account, or I get them to share someone else's account, which then links back to what I was saying about the other clinical worker who wants to improve healthcare outcomes, but can't because he doesn't know who did what, because they're recorded against different names, because identity security wasn't done well. All right, another one. Energy supplier. And I've customized this one a little bit. Maybe some of you will recognize this act. This is an Australian, I was going to say regulation, but law. And there's been an extension to it last year. I think the original set was 2017. But basically, to summarize, Australia realized in 2017 that if they didn't have the ability to make sure that 2 minutes, oh goodness me, okay, sweet. They need to do cybersecurity well. And so in this particular case, I guess coming back to that question about audit findings, using an identity security tool, they were able to get better outcomes. We are going to skip the last one, which is medicine. We've talked about that a bunch already, and we're going to skip questions, and we're going to skip the exercise, and we're going to get right to the important stuff. So why is, once it comes up, identity security important for you? Well, first of all, even if you don't do identity security, you're still going to come across it. Whether you're in a security operations center, most incidents that you investigate will somehow be linked back to an identity. In incident response, almost every breach that you come down to investigating at some point will involve a breach of an identity. In cloud security, guess what the biggest risks are? Over-provisioning to an identity. In risk management, identity controls are the backbone of every framework. So identity is everywhere. Even if it's not your job title, your work will likely touch it, and knowing about it will make you much more effective. But here's the bigger opportunity, linking back to the title of the talk. Identity, to be done at the scale I'm talking about, requires leadership, or at the very least, the ability to marry technology with business. And to succeed, the program of work will need to bring together HR, IT, security, operations, etc. together. Almost no other area of cybersecurity will do that for you. And if you can show that you understand how a business can cut risk and save money and be more effective, you'll be the most in-demand cybersecurity professional there is. And lastly, don't forget about the human side. It's not just about sign-ins or logs. It's about, as I gave examples, making sure that nurses can do their job. It's about making sure that our medical systems can improve, about making sure that new hires, in government can do their jobs and serve us citizens. It's about making sure that the critical infrastructure that we rely on to supply electricity is going to remain running and do that at a low cost. So to me, all of this makes identity security really professional, really special. It is also professional, hence the jacket today. But what I hope you leave today with is understanding that identity security is a unique element of cybersecurity, and that I think it's very valuable that you consider it as a part of your careers. And I would love to stop for questions, but I have a feeling that we're out of time. Is that correct? Yes, we're out of time. So thank you very much. Have a great day and see you out there.